Hey guys, Evrelia here. This is my 5.2 Demonology Guide. First I'm going to talk a little bit about the stat priorities, then I'll cover any essential talents and glyphs, and then we'll jump straight into how to play the spec. For Demonology, your stat priorities vary depending on your current gear level, so there's no hard and fast rule about how to gear. It's also worth noting that the differences between secondary stats only offer small DPS gains, so don't worry about it too much. Now with that in mind, I'll go through some basic stat priorities that should get you by. Your main stat is intellect. Next, you want to be hit capped. This is equal to 15% or 5100 rating. Next, get your haste to at least 3036. This gives you an extra tick of doom. You don't need to go for the corruption breakpoints. Now there is an extra tick of doom during heroism at 8097 haste rating. This is not something you should go for until you're in very good Throne of Thunder gear, because it simply won't be worth the lost stats. Mastery and crit are fairly equal, but crit becomes extremely devalued, especially after you get the Lei Shen trinket. Mastery is a very good stat overall, and it's very good for the other Warlock specs, so it's a good idea to stack that next. Get Mastery first and crit second. For gemming, you should use 160 intellect in red slots, 80 intellect and 160 mastery in yellow slots, and 80 int and 160 hit in blue slots. Talents in MOP are mostly situational choices. Here's a good default set of talents, but you'll want to consider these based upon the needs of every encounter. The level 75 row is the one that's mostly important for DPS. The difference between each of these is very small, particularly between service and supremacy. Generally, service will be the better choice, but only by a very small margin, and it does require you to use an extra cooldown in your rotation. For your pet, you'll be using the Felguard unless there's heavy target swapping, in which case the Imp will be used to prevent him from having to run so much. For glyphs, you should be using the glyph of Imp Swarm. I'll explain why later. Now that the basics are out of the way, let's talk about how to play. Demonology is about managing your demonic fury and going into metamorphosis when you have various procs or buffs active in order to do very high damage in a small burst window. Let's talk about your basic spells. You've got three main dots: Corruption and Doom, which should be kept up all the time, and Shadow Flame. Corruption can only be cast in caster form and it generates 4 demonic fury per tick. Doom can only be cast in Metamorphosis. It costs 60 fury per cast. It lasts for 1 minute and ticks every 15 seconds, varying with haste of course. Whenever it critically strikes, a wild imp will spawn. Shadow Flame is a dot applied when you cast Hand of Gul'dan. This can only be used in caster form. It has 2 charges, so it can be cast twice in a row when needed. It deals splash damage around the initial target and leaves the Shadow Flame dot behind. Shadow Flame lasts for 6 seconds and can stack up to 2 times. Now the optimal way to use Hand of Gul'dan is to wait until you have 2 charges. First you cast it once, and then you cast some other spells for a few seconds. Cast it again when Shadow Flame has 2 seconds remaining, and then go into Metamorphosis. This means you get 5 seconds of a 1-stack Shadow Flame, and 6 seconds of a 2-stack Shadow Flame. The reason that you go into Metamorphosis immediately after casting the second Hand of Gul'dan is because its damage is calculated as it hits the target. This means that your Shadow Flame will be buffed by Metamorphosis. Your single target spells are Shadow Bolt, Soulfire, and Touch of Chaos. Shadow Bolt generates 25 demonic fury and can only be used in caster form. Soulfire generates 30 demonic fury when used in caster form, but costs 160 fury when used in Metamorphosis. Sometimes throughout the fight you'll get a buff called Molten Core. This buff stacks and reduces the cast time, mana cost, and demonic fury cost of your next Soulfire by 50%. You have an 8% chance to gain Molten Core every time your Wild Imps do damage, or when Shadow Flame ticks. You also gain a stack whenever your Soulfire hits a target under 25% health. When you're in Metamorphosis, your Shadow Bolt turns into Touch of Chaos. This is an instant cast spell that costs 40 fury and extends the duration of Corruption. For damage recalculation purposes, this is exactly the same as recasting Corruption. So those are your 6 main spells. You also have 5 cooldown abilities: Metamorphosis, Dark Soul Knowledge, Imp Swarm, Fellstorm, and Service Felguard. Dark Soul Knowledge gives you a huge mastery boost temporarily. You should always pair this up with Metamorphosis. Imp Swarm is a glyph. Now, normally as Demonology, you gain a buff called Demonic Calling every 20 seconds. This means that your direct damage single target spells will spawn a wild imp while you have this buff. With the glyph, the cooldown of Demonic Calling is increased by 4 seconds. However, you can also use the Imp Swarm ability to instantly summon 5 imps. This is equal to the same number of imps per minute, but using them all at once allows you to stack them with other procs to gain a DPS increase. You should only use Imp Swarm with Dark Soul. Fellstorm should be used on cooldown. It is not on the global cooldown. Service Felguard should be used with Dark Soul. So let's talk a bit about the opener. First, drink a potion of the Jade Serpent and begin precasting a Shadow Bolt. Next, use Hand of Gul'dan, then Corruption, Imp Swarm, Grimoire of Service, and then your second Hand of Gul'dan. Now you want to activate Dark Soul and go into Metamorphosis to make sure that your Shadow Flame is buffed. Then apply Doom and start spamming Touch of Chaos until meta runs out. Once it does run out, Soulfire once and then Hand of Gul'dan to give yourself a small Fury boost. Then shift back into meta and spam Touch of Chaos until Dark Soul is expiring. Then shift back into caster form. So throughout the fight, the gameplay is really similar to Affliction in that you want to empower your spells with intellect procs. Dark Soul is your most powerful effect by far, so you'll spend most of your Demonic Fury during that. When it's on cooldown, you'll shift into meta when you have a few intellect procs up in order to extend the duration of your Corruption. You should try to extend the Corruption this way as much as possible, but you can recast in caster form if needed for a minimal DPS loss. So, you'll do a huge burn in meta every time Dark Soul is up, and you'll do small burns whenever you have intellect procs up in order to prevent yourself from reaching full fury and to extend Corruption. You will also shift into meta every time your Hand of Gul'dan stacks need to be applied, as I discussed earlier. Now regarding Soulfire, you should generally only use it when in caster form, but you can use it in meta when the enemy is under 25%. You can also use it during meta if you have some intellect procs up and a lot of fury. Just don't let yourself get fury starved. The reason for this is that Soulfire generates a lot of fury when in caster form and is very expensive in meta. Regardless of all this, don't ever cast it without Molten Core buffs. For AoE situations, you should put Corruption on as many targets as possible, then shift into meta and put Doom on as many targets as possible. Whilst in meta, use Void Ray as your main fury dump and to keep Corruption refreshed. If you have enough fury, you should also use Immolation Aura. You still want to use your cooldown abilities and Imp Swarm in the same way as before. You should also use Carrion Swarm once your Corruptions are at max duration. Once you drop out of meta, use your Hand of Gul'dan as normal and use Hellfire to generate fury. If you found this guide helpful, remember to rate, comment and subscribe.